a military guard of honor around him. His body arrived in Washington this afternoon, stopping briefly at the Navy Memorial. Why? Because former President Carter was the first and only American president to be a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. Later this evening and all day tomorrow, the general public will be allowed into the Capitol Rotunda to pay their respects. And just a short time ago, lawmakers, both parties, took part in a memorial for former President Carter. Carter's funeral service, as Nora just mentioned as she closed out the CBS News special report, will be held Thursday at the National Cathedral before his remains are flown back to Georgia for burial. I want to start tonight with Megan Hayes and Mara Gillespie. Megan served as Director of Message Planning for the Biden administration. Mara previously served as an advisor to former House Speaker John Boehner and former Congressman Adam Kinzinger. Megan, let me just start with you, and Mara, I'll ask you the same question. Global thoughts on President Carter and post-President Carter?
I think that his post-presidency probably said more than his presidency did. I think that he set a tone for how presidents should be able to live their post-life. He did incredible things in his legacy, and I think that he is the perfect example of a legacy being some good and some bad, and really being able to see that. And I think it's really great, as we were talking earlier during the break, that half our country wasn't alive when President Carter was president. And so for people and young people to be able to see all of the impact that he made post-presidency, I think is really great in these tribute services.
Mara, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that for many of us, we view him as the humanitarian. You know, we view his work with Habitat for Humanity, but also his humility, his humble beginnings, his long relationship with Rosalind Carter, his wife, that long marriage. I mean, 77 years. That is astounding to so many of us. And so I think we view it in that lens, but we would be remiss not to look at his legacy as president and those first years before he really built his legacy of humanitarian legacy. You know, he was interfering in ways, you know, post-presidency with foreign affairs and making life difficult for George H.W. Bush and getting involved in foreign matters. And so there is that part of his legacy that we can't necessarily forget. But in a moment like today, we look at the humanitarian and the life overall of Jimmy Carter.
Megan, I also want you to evaluate former President Carter in this sense, because I do believe he is an important first in our modern political orientation toward the presidency. The first true outsider who ran as an identified outsider, who was not, in his words, tainted by too much experience in Washington or the shell game of Washington or the give and take in Washington. He was not the first. He began an entire process of people campaigning for the presidency as outsiders. The only exception to that is George Herbert Walker Bush. Every other one, even Ronald Reagan ran as a kind of outsider. Bill Clinton ran as an outsider. Certainly Barack Obama did. George W. Bush did. And I think the absolute ringleader of outsiderism would be Donald Trump. And then President Biden would be an institutionalist in between that as well.
But he also ran as an outsider, right? They called him Scranton Joe. And also, he was the first person, President Biden was the first person to endorse Jimmy Carter.
Back in 1976.
Exactly. So, you know, it's an interesting, and if you listen to some of Carter's speeches and some of the things that President Biden says now about being more optimistic than you have been before and thinking more for America than what we have right now, they have a lot of parallels. And it's really interesting to sort of see the parallels in their presidencies and some of how their legacy is going to play out. So I do think, you know, he did set the tone, and he did show a way to run as an outsider and show that average people and normal people can be the president, whether or not it was accepted at the time. I think it's much more accepted now than it probably was when Carter did it.
Outsiderism began with Jimmy Carter, right, Maura? Sort of?
I think that the pendulum just swings, and that just shows us what our electorate does. There was all the Nixon drama. And so looking at an outsider was, we need to get away from the establishment and what's happening in D.C., let's get an outsider. And then the pendulum swung back, right? And we saw it happen with Trump and then Biden. And so, yes, if he ran as Scranton Joe, but reality was that we had an outsider who did not do the best job. And in both situations, they wanted to go for somebody who had a little more meat behind them, if you will. And so I think that there is this idea that we wanted a little more stability at a certain time of our history. And that's why we chose who we chose. And if we weren't happy with certain aspects, like the economy or whatever it may have been, then we chose somebody else based on those issues. It comes back down just to issues and what's happening in the United States at that moment or in the world at that moment. It's not necessarily always the person themselves.
Megan, It struck me that this may be one of the last times we see formal public remarks from Vice President Kamala Harris before the exiting of the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration. She noted accomplishments from her vantage point of the Carter presidency, creation of the Department of Energy, the Department of Education, FEMA, clean energy initiatives, and judicial appointments. For most Democrats looking back on Jimmy Carter, are those the greatest hits?
I mean, I think so, but I think that most Democrats are looking back on his humanitarian efforts post-presidency. I do think, he did play a lot. In the Panama Canal, there's some other foreign policy things, good and bad foreign policy things that he did, also having appointing so many judges. He appointed Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which was a longstanding in our Supreme Court. So I do think that, yes, and he had more women, I think, than anyone else had appointed into his administration. So there are some things that have now been eclipsed as modern times have taken over. But, I think we just go back to Jimmy Carter's legacy is really his post-presidency and his humanitarian efforts and what he did post-presidency, and I think that is what people are going to really hold their hat on with him.
Maura, your last thoughts?
I think Democrats would be wise to do that and not focus on what he did during his presidency because he wasn't very popular. And in those early years, directly after I think some of his advisors said, well, he forgot he wasn't president. I would hate for that to be repeated in the future for any presidents who forget that they're no longer president. I think that we would be best, and Democrats would be best served by focusing on the humanitarian aspect for sure.
The last word, Maura Gillespie and Megan Hayes. Thanks so very much. We appreciate it.